designers and architects of Washington, D.C. were Masons, starting with George Washington himself, who was a high-ranking Mason and who was a leading force and a guiding force for both the location of the city and the layout of the city.
Washington's authority as the father of a new nation would set the course for America's capital city, beginning with its designer. George Washington was still president during the time that the plan for the city was conceived. Washington had commissioned Major Pierre Charles L'Enfant to work out the initial street design. L'Enfant had come from France with the Marquis de Lafayette and served with Washington during the Revolutionary War as one of his officers. He was known as a temperamental Frenchman, sometimes difficult, if not impossible, to work with.
He, as I understand it, felt very strongly about the plan that he developed for the street layout of the city. So much so that when minor changes were suggested, he became irate.
Have to change.
Oh,
These
absolutely
roads
not. No changes.
These
No
roads going into the
changes.
swamps can't be done.
But nonetheless, if you look at his original plan, which is of course available, you can see maps, his map, and it is very similar to the current layout of the city.
L'Enfant insisted his original design be followed to the letter, something that would later lead to his dismissal from the project. Yet even so, one Masonic author writes that the early architects responsible for individual buildings did attempt with considerable success to honor L'Enfant's master plan. He goes on to call it an arcane schema to be established with the aid of interested Masons. Yet in the planning stages, L'Enfant was particularly at odds with Thomas Jefferson.
These guys had a terrible, they just did not get along. Jefferson, of course, was a very important part of the designing of Washington, D.C.
Jefferson himself, along with Benjamin Franklin, was said to be deeply involved in astronomy. Jefferson spent 5 years as the American ambassador to France. When he returned, he brought with him the influence of European architecture. Along with Washington, Jefferson, and L'Enfant was Andrew Ellicott, the surveyor for the city, and Benjamin Banneker, his assistant. Banneker has been called the man who loved the stars. He was a free-born African-American who published a famous almanac on astronomy. His influence on the design of Washington, D.C. has been greatly disputed. Some believe that when Pierre L'Enfant was fired from the project, he took his designs with him.
Good day, sir. L'Enfant.
And that Benjamin Banneker was able to recreate the plan from his photographic memory later on. Others argue that copies of L'Enfant's design were still available, and that the unfinished elements were then added by the surveyor, Andrew Ellicott, a little-known figure who some believe was a Freemason. While mysteries abound about the specifics, one thing all of the designers and surveyors seemed to have in common was an interest in the esoteric elements that would compose Washington, D.C. Ultimately, when the final design was presented, George Washington chose to call it the L'Enfant Plan. Perhaps the most influential researcher into the L'Enfant Plan and the mysterious arcane elements of Washington, D.C. has been David Oveson, who wrote the book, The Secret Architecture of Our Nation's Capital. In his book, Oveson argues that the real mystery of Washington, D.C. is to be found in Federal Triangle.
What Overson felt was that federal triangle was basically reflected from the stars.
Oveson's research, more than any other, confirms the idea that Washington, D.C. was built according to Hermetic principles, as above, so below.
It was laid out to reflect what was going on in the stars, where you had a right-angled triangle surrounding the constellation of Virgo.
The right-angled triangle surrounding Virgo is partly reflected in the layout of Federal Triangle and symbolizes the Pythagorean theorem. The theorem simply states that the base of a right triangle squared and the perpendicular side of a right triangle squared are equal to the third side, known as the hypotenuse. This theorem is said to be of unique and mysterious importance in Freemasonry.
It's interesting that in the third degree of Masonry, the Master Mason candidate is given several lectures. And one of the lectures, he is told to meditate upon the 47th problem of Euclid, which is also the 47th theorem of Pythagoras. And it's also known as the Pythagorean theorem, which is the sum of the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the square of the other two sides in a right triangle. And of course, everybody goes, huh? You know, what's that got to do with anything? But it sounds really impressive. And of course, it's never explained. You have to go and look it up. You have to take the initiative and go into a Masonic library or a Scottish Rite library. Fortunately, there was a huge one in Milwaukee where I lived. And then you learn what they're being told. What they're being told is that, again, symbols have different levels of meaning. And for example, the upright part of a right triangle symbolizes Baal. The horizontal part of the right triangle symbolizes the female, who is of course prostrate and passive. And the hypotenuse, which connects the two, that symbolizes the divine child that the Baal and the goddess create. Baal and Astarte, Isis and Osiris, pick the name, they're all the same thing. They're trying to evoke the trinity, the pagan trinity of Baal or Osiris and Isis and Horus.
The squared elements of this Pythagorean trinity resemble the letter Y. In his book, David Oveson suggests that Washington, D.C. was intentionally placed at the split of the Potomac and Eastern rivers to symbolize this Pythagorean Y. It was George Washington who outlined the 10 square mile parameter for the city, according to the cardinal directions. But Oveson's principal theory is that in L'Enfant's original plan, the White House, Washington Monument, and Capitol Building were designed in a right triangle, according to a star pattern above, where 3 stars surround the constellation Virgo, forming a stellar triangle.